Bermondsey is the area of London that extends about 1.5 miles east of London Bridge along the south bank of the River Thames. It's very close to central London and, as a result, it's a popular place for city workers to live. Historically, though, it was famous for its industry. Many sizable breweries used to operate here, and Sarsons had a large vinegar factory close to Tower Bridge. However, it was the leather industry which dominated Bermondsey's economy most of all. At its height in the 19th century, Bermondsey was the largest leather-producing area in the United Kingdom, and its streets were home not just to tanners and finishers of leather, but also to fellmongers and wool staplers, to parchment makers and leather merchants, to suppliers of chemicals used in leather production, to companies that used that leather to manufacture goods, and even to those who made use of the industry's waste, hair and wool, such as hatters and felt makers. The leather industry itself has since gone, but we can still see its traces as we walk around modern Bermondsey. Today, leather is still widely used in fashion and upholstery. Before the development and then the mass production and use of plastics and synthetics in the second half of the 20th century, leather was ubiquitous. It was by far the most popular choice for making footwear, gloves, aprons, belts, and other items of clothing. And as England's population rose from, say, 6 or 7 million people in 1750 to around 40 million in 1950, so demand for leather soared. In these centuries, roads and communications improved enormously too, which meant an increased use of leather to make harnesses and saddles. Of course, demand for saddlery fell in the 20th century as the motor car replaced horse-drawn transport, but at that time, leather was the material used to upholster cars, so one market replaced another, to an extent at least. Britain's military required vast amounts of leather too: boots, saddles, scabbards and holsters for soldiers, pumps and hoses for sailors. At times of war, of which there were many, these demands could be very significant indeed. To take just one example, in the summer months of 1811, the army contracted to buy 638,000 pairs of shoes in a month. The 200 years from 1750 to 1950 were Britain's industrial centuries also. Industrialisation had only a limited effect on the manufacture of leather itself. With low labour costs, there was little incentive for producers to mechanise, although the introduction of the splitting machine early in the 19th century did allow tanners to split a skin or a hide in half horizontally and thereby double the amount of usable leather which they could produce. A century later, tanneries began to use chrome instead of vegetable tanning materials too, which greatly reduced the amount of time it took to tan leather. The bigger effects on the leather industry were vicarious. For example, more leather was needed to make belts, buckets and bellows, rollers and washers, or valves and sleeves for use in mines and factories. With industrialisation came urbanisation and the development of canals, railways and steamships, all of which facilitated the use of raw materials from across the globe and the concentration of leather production in Britain's towns and cities. There was then greater demand across Britain for leather, which drove huge increases in production. Between 1750 and 1850, English and Welsh tanners doubled their output, so that at the end of that period, they were producing some £66 million of leather a year. At that time, leather manufacture was probably the second or third largest industry in the country. And what of Bermondsey? Well, on this map here, created by John Rock in the middle of the 18th century, we can already see tanning yards along Long Lane and Grange Road. We'll learn more about how to make leather soon, but for now we need only note that Bermondsey had pretty much everything that a tanner could want. It was close to London, then as now the largest city in England. London was the place where the most meat was consumed, and therefore also the place where the most skins and hides were available. Fortunately, it was also not just out with the city, but downwind and downriver of it too, so the smells and waste of the leather manufacturing processes caused less nuisance to those within the city itself. Tanners use a great deal of water in the tanning process, and tidal streams such as the Neckinger, which flowed through Bermondsey into the River Thames, provided them with clean and fresh water and a repository for their waste. To tan leather, one also needs a tannin. Traditionally, oak bark was used for that purpose in England, and a few miles to the south of Bermondsey lay the Great North Wood, a rich source of this valuable product too. Consequently, by the late 17th century, there may already have been as many as 80 tanneries in Bermondsey. And 100 years later, one author could write that the tanneries of Bermondsey are very numerous and carry on that business to a greater extent than is known in any part of the kingdom. From a natural connection between the several trades, there are also many wool staplers, fellmongers, curriers, leather dressers and parchment makers. In 1812, just one site in Bermondsey, Francis Brewing, produced 1.25% of all English leather. Initially, the butchers of Smithfield and the foresters of the Great North Wood could meet the demand for raw material from Bermondsey's tanners, albeit usually through dealers or factors rather than directly. But as demand for leather grew, England could not supply enough hides, skins and tannins for its domestic industry. Before 1750, domestic slaughters provided for at least 95% of all English leather production. A century later, this had fallen to just 60%. The same was true of bark, 4 to 5 pounds of which was needed to tan 1 pound of leather. Before 1780, domestic production met demand, but 50 years of expansion and deforestation later, some 49,000 tonnes, that is, 1/2 of the total consumption of bark, was imported. Consequently, the leather industry became increasingly concentrated, either in port cities like Liverpool, Hull, Glasgow and Bristol, or in cities such as Warrington, Bolton and Leeds, which were well connected to the sea by canals or rivers. Bermondsey, adjacent to the River Thames of course, benefited from this development too. Raw materials could easily be brought in and the finished products just as easily transported out. We'll start our exploration of Bermondsey's leather industry outside London Bridge Station on St Thomas's Street. This was the entry point to what would have been a very malodorous and cacophonous realm indeed. In fact, so important for leather production in the UK was Bermondsey that this house, number 9 St Thomas's Street, was for a long time known as Leather Trade House. It was home, at various times, to a dizzying array of industry bodies: the British Leather Federation, the Leather Institute, the Museum of Leathercraft, the Leather and Hides Benevolent Institution, and associations representing leather producers, kid tanners, leather good manufacturers, leather industry suppliers, and buyers and retailers were all headquartered here. Now, Leather UK, which incorporated many of those bodies, and the Museum of Leather are both based in Northampton, but this site seems as good a place as any to begin our walk. This map was prepared for insurance companies in 1887. We can see that here, on St Thomas's Street, were 2 warehouses belonging to Bevingtons and Sons at the top and Samuel Barrow and Brother on the corner of Weston Street, here at the bottom. These firms were 2 of the largest manufacturers in the area. They both had sizable tanning operations a half a mile or so to the south and east of here. But their warehouses, built to hold finished leather from their tanneries as well as imported pelts and leather, were here, closer to the Thames and to the City of London, and so better connected and more convenient for buyers and other merchants. At Bevington's warehouse, for example, they stored tanned goat and sheepskins that had arrived in London from Madras in bales weighing £560, which were inspected by buyers before auctions. Unfortunately, both warehouses were destroyed by enemy action in the Second World War. The darker colours on this map represent the most severe bomb damage. But some original warehouses do survive close by. In this little row on Weston Street, for example, were sometime offices of James Cock & Son, J&W Dunn, E.S. Ward Pickled Pelts, the Fancy Leather Company, and All Leathers Limited. In fact, importers, merchants, factors or distributors, including E. Rees, Scriven Brothers, the Bay Leather and Rubber Company, Shaw, Pearson and Smith, Daniels and Daniels Limited, AE Bond Limited and CB Daniels crammed into this small area at the top of Bermondsey. There are many more traces of Bermondsey's leather heritage further down Western Street, to which we shall return later. For now, however, we'll turn left into Snowsfield and walk past the Guinness Trust buildings on our right, a wonderful example of philanthropic endeavour to provide homes for Londoners in what was then a very deprived part of London indeed. At the end of the 19th century, Charles Booth funded his research into the social, economic and religious lives of Londoners from the profits of his family's shipping business, which at that time was rapidly becoming one of the biggest players in the British leather industry. His researchers found widespread poverty in this area, hardly surprising when we consider that wages in Bermondsey's manufacturing industries were almost always low. Indeed, they categorised most people in this area as poor, very poor, or in the lowest class of vicious semi-criminals, as is shown in blue and black on this map. As we reach the end of Snowsfield, where it meets Bermondsey Street, we find a building, unfortunately vandalised, but on which we can just discern the traces of some former advertising. Thanks to Roy Reed's efforts, we can now recover the text. William Walker & Sons Limited were a large leather manufacturer based in Bolton, Lancashire, with a significant tannery and warehouse at Rose Hill in that town, particularly famous for producing solbens. But they had connections and a presence here in Bermondsey too. In 1919, Walkers purchased a property in Western Street where they made their speciality dry ped leather, using both vegetable materials and chrome in the tanning process to produce a light yet long-lasting leather. Walker's London office and warehouse was just around the corner from here on Maze Pond, on a site now swallowed up by Guy's Hospital. Hepburn, Gale and Ross Limited were one of the largest tanneries in Bermondsey at that time, and their managing director was William Arthur Posnett, nephew to William Walker. The leather industry may well have been a large national concern, but it was also dominated by a relatively small number of families who intermarried or who sat on the boards of each other's companies. Today, Bermondsey Street is a pleasant road lined with bars, restaurants and independent shops. However, it would have been a very different prospect indeed in the heyday of leather manufacture here. East Kinsey and East had a large tannery on Carmarthen Place, then as now a small yard tucked just off Bermondsey Street on the right as we walk down. Almost directly opposite this yard at 55 Bermondsey Street was another leather firm, Tempo Leather. Their building, now used mostly for office space, is known as a tanneries, and as we look around we do not have to look too hard to find plenty of other reminders of the area's leather heritage. Almost next door is the hired bar and restaurant, while over the road we see the Tanner & Co pub with its Tanner Warehouse event space and the Wool Yard, while a little further down stands a fashion and textile museum. Leather is made through a series of chemical processes that preserve the skin or hide of an animal so that it cannot putrefy, while at the same time preserving its natural fibrous structure to give the finished product its strength and pliability. We use the term skins to describe the pelts from smaller animals, for example sheep and goats, and hides for those from larger animals like cattle and horses. Man has made leather for thousands of years, and until the second half of the 19th century, it was produced in essentially an unchanged way. That is, through a three-stage procedure using manual labour, natural products, and long periods where the pelt was immersed in solutions held in pits. Bermondsey Street runs north to south in the parish of St Mary Magdalene. This map shows a number of tanning pits within that parish. As we can see, the further down Bermondsey Street towards the church one went, the more tanning pits that one would have found. Almost all these tanning pits have now disappeared, of course, but here, at the top of the street, a few traces of some remain in the yard of the tanneries building. The first stage of the leather production process involves preparing a pelt for tanning. Skins or hides which were either fresh or salted would be washed to remove dung, salt, and any other dirt which they had acquired. Then, any residual grease, flesh, and hair would be removed. The easiest way to do this is by liming, that is, soaking the skin or hide in pits like these, filled with slaked lime mixed with sodium sulfide or similar chemicals, to dissolve the hair roots and lower layers of the epidermis. And then, by scraping with a sharp knife to remove both flesh and hair. Today, unhairing is still done chemically, but fleshing is done by machine. Previously, however, pelts were fleshed by hand over a beam. Once they had been treated in this way, the pelts were then put back into pits filled with limes to prepare them to receive the tanning materials. Before the first stage concluded, it was common to bait or pure the pelts, especially if a soft or stretchy leather was desired. Thanks to the research efforts of the Nottinghamshire tanner Joseph Turney Wood, at the end of the 19th century, this process is now done by artificial enzymes. Before then, however, bird or animal dung was used to remove the lime and make the product flabby. In fact, in mid-19th century London, people would roam the streets of the city collecting dog, horse and other manure to be used in Bermondsey's tanneries, hoping to fetch perhaps 1 shilling for a full pail of pure. Henry Mayhew provides us with a vivid description of how they went about their work. The pure finders always carry a handle basket, generally with a cover to hide the contents, and have their right hand covered with a black leather glove. Many of them, however, dispense with the glove, as they say it is much easier to wash their hands than to keep the glove fit for use. The women generally have a large pocket for the reception of such rags as they may chance to fall in with, but they pick up those only of the very best quality, and will not go out of their way to search even for them. Thus equipped, they may be pursuing their avocation in almost every street in and about London. Well, some avocation indeed. All that was left to complete the first stage was scudding, that is, scraping the grain side of the pelt with a blunt knife to remove any dirt, lime, hair follicles, etc. Perhaps drenching, which involved using a mild acid liquor to get rid of the lime and scud, and pickling if the pelt was to be transported in this state. At this point, the hide or skin is still not leather. We'll return to the second stage of the tanning process in a while. But with all these animal skins and hides, fleshing and unhairing, liming, puring and baiting, we certainly are getting an idea of just how unwholesome this business must have been, aren't we? We'll continue by walking past Tyers Gate, where a few original buildings, formerly home to different manufacturers, factors and merchants, survive. When we get to Leathermarket Street, we'll turn right. Ahead of us at the fork of the road is a former wool warehouse. Morocco Street, named after Morocco leather, a soft form of leather widely used in bookbinding and for wallets and purses, runs to our left. Our Penny & Sons Limited used to be here at number 1 Morocco Street, from which warehouse they would import and distribute raw and tanned skins. Other leather firms crowded into this small road, including Strong, Rule & Strong, a company which would go on to become one of the largest leather businesses in the country as Strong & Fisher. Leathermarket Street was little different. It too was home to dozens of companies involved in the leather trade, especially dealers in hides and skins, and, despite the damage caused by Nazi bombs in the Second World War, some original 19th century buildings do survive here and there. In this warehouse, for example, at any given time, you might have found the offices of Rock & Sons, J.W. Wood & Co. Limited, Henry Jeffrey and Brothers, M. Emmanuel, Knightley Durrell Limited, and the Hearst Leather Corporation. Dealers in pelts had always played an important role in supplying tanneries, especially those in the towns of cities of England, with the raw materials that they needed. They became increasingly important in the 19th century, however, as the value and volume of imports rose, and their capacity to store stocks helped to even out disparities in supply and demand. At the start of that century, the leather industry was, in theory at least, strictly demarcated and restricted. Only fellmongers could remove the wool from sheepskins. Only dealers could trade in hides and skins. Only tanners could tan those skins and hides into leather. Only curriers and dressers could treat the leather and shave it to the thickness required by customers. There were, too, excise duties, that is, a tax similar to that levied on alcohol or tobacco today, payable on sales of leather. In 1830, in order to encourage manufacturing, commerce and industry, the government removed these duties and all other legal restraints on the leather trade. Now, one person or one firm could tan and dress leather and freely buy raw materials and sell the finished product. As a result, fellmongers, tanners, curriers and even factors began to merge, forming larger and more efficient companies. These developments had a significant impact in Bermondsey. Traditionally, London's Hyde Market had been held at Leadenhall, but it was already overcrowded in the 17th century, and concerns were increasingly raised about bringing raw hides into the centre of a city which was home to hundreds of thousands of people. New markets had therefore sprung up around the city at Westminster, Newgate, Islington, Whitechapel and Southwark. In the early 1820s, these markets, along with others in 6 cities, Liverpool, Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, Sheffield and Newcastle, supplied roughly 1/5 of British raw skins and 1/4 of British hides. As the leather trade continued to expand and open up, so there were more trade in raw materials and finished leather, more factors and dealers, and larger manufacturing operations. Consequently, Bermondsey's leather producers came together via a joint stock company called the London Leather Warehouse Company to build a new leather market in Bermondsey. This market, which opened in 1833 at a cost of £50,000, was divided into 2 areas. The first, here on the left where we see the numbers 837 and 838, comprised a grassy quadrangle surrounded by warehouses where leather was bought and sold. The second area, open and paved and surrounded by a covered arcade, where we see 839, was where dealers traded skins and hides. Unfortunately, the leather market is another building which did not survive the Second World War intact. The industrial areas of South and East London were very heavily bombed after all. But some of it does remain, and it is clear that in its day it was a very impressive building. Now it is mostly serviced offices, but here and there we find traces of the businesses that used to trade here. The presence of a commercial centre here, alongside the tanneries and other manufacturing sites, acted as a further boost to the leather industry in Bermondsey too. Within a decade or two of the establishment of the market, perhaps 1/3 of all British leather was being produced in this part of South London. Indeed, to cope with the growth in business, a new market, the London Leather Hide and Wool Exchange, designed by George Elkington and Sons, was opened on the corner of Weston Street and Leather Market in 1879. Although this exchange was only a limited success, many merchants increasingly preferred to trade directly from their warehouses in the area. The opening of this building was the final nail in the coffin for London's Leadenhall Market. It closed and was redeveloped for retail in the following 2 years. The Leather Hide and Wool Exchange has survived, and it stands as an imposing evocation of Bermondsey's industrial heritage. It has a large porch, and above the ground floor windows are roundels carved with scenes from the leather industry. Here we can see a dealer selling a quantity of rawhides by weight, sorted, folded and tied with coarse string, presumably to a tanner. In this image, depicting a scene from the first stage of the tanning process that we discussed earlier, 2 men scrape a pelt to remove its flesh and hair. We have photographs of men working in exactly this way in Bermondsey's tanneries, and outside Leather Sellers Hall in London is a statue of the same too. Earlier, we noted how skins and hides were prepared for tanning. In this third carving, we can see the traditional tanning process itself. Today, some 90% of hides and skins are tanned by being placed into a revolving drum or rockers, with a chromium sulfate solution for several hours. However, before the development of chrome tanning at the end of the 19th century, tanners would immerse prepared pelts in pits filled with water and vegetable tannins, moving them from pit to pit using poles, with each pit filled with tanning liquor of different strengths, over the course of as much of a year or so. This process, called vegetable tanning, was a very slow one. It did not require many machines, although sometimes cranes might be used to move the hides and skins, but it did tie up lots of capital in raw materials for extended periods, and it did demand lots of land for the dozens, scores, or even hundreds of pits that we can see in this map here. Veg tanning has not been completely superseded. It still produces leather especially suitable for soles, belting, harnesses, bags, cases, upholstery, and for fancy leather work. And nowadays some 10% of all leather is veg tanned. It is at the conclusion of this point that the skins or hides have become leather, but the product still needs to be finished and then sold to a customer or merchant. We'll say more about finishing soon, but for now we'll just note that these two final stages are depicted on two more roundels. The first one shows tanned skins being hung up to dry and then embossed, and the second represents a buyer inspecting a finished product. Before moving on, however, one thing that you might want to do at this point if you decide to do this walk is stop at the Leather Exchange pub next door to the Historic Exchange. It's not just a perfectly appropriate place to stop for some refreshment. Inside this pub are many memorials of local industry and its leading figures too. The upstairs function room of the pub, for example, is named after Samuel Bevington, and we'll learn a lot more about him soon as well. Leaving the pub and turning left into Western Street, we'll come to Long Lane, where we'll then turn left again. 3 minutes down Long Lane is another pub with a connection to the leather trade, Simon the Tanner. According to the Acts of the Apostles, St. Peter stayed with Simon the Tanner on at least 3 occasions, and Peter's association with Simon represents the willingness of the earliest Christians to embrace the most humble of artisans. It is no surprise that we find a pub with a name like this on this road in particular. There were at least 11 tan yards and 1 fellmonger here by 1800, and over the course of the next 150 or so years, existing businesses expanded and new ones opened, making this the beating heart of Bermondsey's leather industry. Most of them were small family-run independent firms, but a few were much larger enterprises, and 2 of Bermondsey's largest leather manufacturers, who combined to form one of the biggest firms in the national industry, were located at the end of Long Lane and some 500 yards to the east on Grange Road. In the 18th century, John and Thomas Hepburn established a tannery, which, as we can see on this 19th century map, had become a large tanning and dressing operation at 239 Long Lane, called Hepburn and Gale. This building, which dates to around 1875, gives a sense of just how commanding some of the tanneries and warehouses in this area were. In 1895, Hepburn and Gale bought Alexander Ross. Ross manufactured leather goods, mostly for the British military, and in 1901 the new company began to redevelop its site at Grange Mills, 19 Grange Road, where now stand these apartments. Shortly thereafter, the two businesses formally merged to become Hepburn, Gale and Ross, a vertically integrated tanner, dresser and manufacturer. During the Great War, when there was huge demand for leather, of course, this company employed almost 3,000 people, including many women, at their various sites in Bermondsey. In 1920, it integrated yet further, merging with Samuel Barrow and Brothers Limited, which was also a well-established Bermondsey tannery, but which had a very significant merchanting operation, to form a new company called Barrow, Hepburn and Gale, and then by Richard Hodgson and Sons, a large tannery in Beverley, Yorkshire. This was unfortunate timing. The leather industry, along with many others, was about to experience a post-war slump, and the merger was far from happy. By 1922, the operation here at Long Lane had been shut down. Instead, the new company tanned leather at the Grange and Bermondsey tanneries close by, while its headquarters, administrative offices, leather storerooms and departments manufacturing leather goods were all located at Grange Mills. By 1929, the Barrow family and others had left to re-establish Samuel Barrow & Co. as a leather merchant. Things began to improve in the 1930s. Barrow, Hepburn and Gale continued to diversify, and it benefited from increased war demand between 1939 and 1945. By 1948, it owned some 12 subsidiaries in London, the East Midlands, Yorkshire and even South Africa, the latter of which supplied tanning extracts. At that time, Barrow, Hepburn and Gale were getting through 25,000 tonnes of tanning extract in a year. It employed thousands of people and turned over millions of pounds each year. Its chairman, George Odey's CBE, also sat as a Conservative MP from 1947 to 1955. It was involved at every stage of the process by which leather was produced, used and distributed. Tanning and currying, manufacturing leather goods for domestic and industrial use, supplying tanning extracts, producing gelatine, glue and fibre goods, and dealing both in hides and skins as well as finished leather. The story of Barrow, Hepburn and Gale's development into a large vertically integrated enterprise like this is, in fact, typical of developments across the country in this period between 1850 and 1950, as the industry rationalised and consolidated into the hands of large players like William Walker, Strong and Fisher and the Booth Group. We'll come on to consider the decline of the leather industry here in Bermondsey and in England soon, but now let us just note that these names are no longer with us. The Booth Group name disappeared in the 1980s after acquisitions from Garner Scott Blair and Pittards. Garner Scott Blair was descended, in part at least, from another Bermondsey tanner, James Garner and Sons Limited. Indeed, James Garner was just 20 years old when he established a tannery in 1865, which specialised in sheepskins, especially using the grain splits to make sweatbands for hats. Subsequently, the firm built up a reputation for its bookbinding leathers. Nothing is left of the tannery at Grange Yard now. Almost everything here is post-war housing. But at one time, it was covered in tanning pits, and Garners were one of the last big names to dress leather in Bermondsey. As we continue our walk along Grange Road, we pass the site of the Alaska factory, former home of C.W. Martin and Sons Limited. This Art Deco building, designed by Wallace Gilbert and Partners in 1932, the firm which was also responsible for the Firestone and Hoover factories on the Great West Road, is now apartments. However, it stands on a site which was once the largest fur processing operation in the United Kingdom, employing as many as 1/10 of all fur workers in the country. Charles W. Martin acquired the original factory in the 1870s, at that time specialising in removing the fur from sealskins, hence the name Alaska. In the 20th century, it broadened its remit, dyeing, reconditioning and dealing in all manner of furs, and during World War II, it processed almost 350,000 sheepskins for manufacture into flying suits for the RAF and 100,000 for linings for flying coats. Martins may not have been a leather producer, but his presence here reminds us of just how many ancillary and related industries there were in contemporary Bermondsey. After turning left into the Grange and passing Grange Yard, we'll turn right into Grange Walk and at the end of the road, left onto Neckinger, named after the tidal stream that used to flow along here and into the Thames at Dockhead or St Saviour's Dock. At its top end, where once stood the Fleece Public House, Neckinger meets Abbey Street, named after the monastery which was here in the Middle Ages. At one time, the Abbey had a mill on the stream here. After the dissolution, there stood a water pump and then a paper mill, and the site thus acquired the name Neckinger Mills. In 1806, it was acquired by 4 brothers and business partners, the Bevingtons, a Quaker family which had been involved in tanning outside London since the 17th century. They were also importers and merchants. It was their warehouse which we saw earlier on St Thomas's Street. And the regular flow of the stream at Neckinger Mills enabled Bevington's to become one of the largest leather manufacturers in the UK as well. Indeed, they were still tanning and dressing leather here until well into the 1970s, which made them the longest lasting of the Bermondsey leather companies also, with a 170-year-long connection to the area. As manufacturers, Bevington's specialised in the light leather trade, that is, goat, sheep and calf, many of which skins were imported from the Cape, Central and Eastern Europe and the Far East. But their operations were wide-ranging. At Neckinger Mills in the 19th century, for example, they would also tan seal and reptile leather. The site was massive, and in the 1830s it was bisected by the London and Greenwich railway line into London Bridge. The company directors at that time were savvy enough to realise that the 27 railway arches would provide a perfect storage area, cool in the summer and warm in the winter, and seal skins were packed in sorting casks and then piled up in the arches, with the salt and residual blubber acting as a preservative. Some warehouses, built in 1864, still stand to the north of the railway line. Now they are mostly used as studios with cars parked in the yard that used to be covered in tanning pits. But some reminders of the site's former glories, including signs and some former measuring scales, are visible here too. At the start of the 20th century, more than 500 people were employed at Neckinger Mills, typically working from 8 until 6 on weekdays with an hour's break for lunch, and then from 8 till 2 on Saturdays. For this 51-hour working week, tanners, lime jobbers and table hands were paid 25 shillings a week. During the Great War, of course, women were employed in significant numbers at Neckinger Mills, and business boomed. Up to 1915, Bevington's weekly sales averaged £13,000, but by the end of 1916, they had increased to between £30,000 and £50,000. As reward for their efforts, in November 1916, the men working here were given an extra 2 shillings a week as a war bonus. The workers at Neckinger Mills would perform every stage of the manufacturing process. They prepared the skins and hides and then tanned them in the ways that we saw earlier. They also dressed the leather, and it is this stage perhaps that required the greatest skill. Certainly, the dressers and finishers had the opportunity really to change the nature of the finished product. It is at this point that leather might be embossed or glazed, rendered stiff or supple, or coloured or dyed in trays, vats, drums or pits in the dye house. Curriers, for example, were employed to produce heavier, less flexible, strong and waterproof leathers, suitable say for harnessing, belting, mechanical uses, welting or even upper leathers. They cleaned the rough tan product and then used a shave to reduce it to a desired thickness. After all, leather is a natural product, and at this point its thickness would have been determined by the size of the pelt and how it had reacted during the tanning process. The currier would also smooth the leather and introduce grease into it, perhaps dubbin or tallow. Light leathers, on the other hand, would usually be finished by tanners in special finishing houses on site. We'll leave Bevington's behind us and head west along Druid Street. This road is now locally famous as it forms the upper part of Bermondsey's Beer Mile. In the last 10 or 15 so years, microbreweries have been set up in many of these railway arches. And if you do this walk on a Friday evening or a Saturday, you'll see the street thronged with thirsty visitors. In this way, this street echoes the area's historic connection to the local brewing industry. Halfway along Druid Street, we'll turn left into Tana Street, which name needs no explanation. Again, if one is here on a Saturday, one will find Morocco Street food market in full swing. To my mind, a better experience than Borough Market. Tana Street was home to many leather businesses, and recalling their names gives us a sense of the industry's variety in what is a very small road indeed. Victor Hareman Limited specialised in horsehides, George Whitlow in kid, while Reptile Dressers Limited did exactly what we would imagine them to have done. S.O. Rowan Sons used to be here too, opposite Sarson's vinegar factory, for at least 50 years, and they did a lot of reptile tanning, as well as hand-grained Morocco leather, which is made by rubbing the grain side to bring out the natural pattern of the skin. In the late 1970s, some 60 workers were still employed at Rose. Very little trace remains of these businesses, but this building at 54 Tana Street was from 1872 home to J&W Dunn, specialists in fine leather work. Tana Road continues straight on and comes back out onto Bermondsey Street, but will turn right onto Tower Bridge Road. Almost immediately on our right is an imposing building, which used to house the National College for the Leather Industry, commonly known as Leather Sellers College. The college opened in 1909, but to understand something of this building's past, we have to go further back in time. Historically, men and women had learnt trades such as tanning or currying through apprenticeships. From 1563, the legal status of apprenticeship in England was defined by the Statute of Artificers. In London, however, the legal status of apprenticeship predated that by a considerable time. In theory, London's livery companies, that is, the descendants of medieval guilds, regulated and administered apprenticeships within the city. In this indenture here, for example, we can see that William Neal was bound as an apprentice under the auspices of the Curriers Company in 1729. In practice, of course, the companies had never exercised complete control of apprenticeship in London, and already by 1729, whatever authority they did have was breaking down. The company's legal privileges had been eroded in the courts. London had become too big a city for the companies to supervise. The city's economy was more open and capitalistic, quite at odds with the closed world of the medieval artisan. And as Britain began to industrialise, so the importance of apprenticeship declined. In 1814, the Statute of Artificers was repealed, and in 1835 and 56, the final vestiges of company control of the crafts of London were removed. In this new world, what now was the point of the livery companies at all? If they were to play no part in administering and regulating their craft, especially when it came to training, then what good were they actually doing? Most companies were small and far from wealthy, but a few were very rich indeed, and some reformers began to eye their endowments greedily. At that time, not only was there no national system for technical education at all, there was also a widespread anxiety that Britain was losing its competitive edge as Germany and America industrialised rapidly. Many began to imagine how the company's money might be appropriated to establish polytechnics or training institutes across the land. In response to this pressure, the Corporation of London and 16 livery companies established the City and Guilds Institute for the Advancement of Technical Education in 1878 to provide a national system of technical education. Although this new philanthropic spirit did not take immediate root in all companies, there can be little doubt that it gave many of the city's companies new purpose. The leather sellers and the cordwainers companies had been among those involved in setting up the City and Guilds Institute, and a decade later they also worked together to establish a leather trade school at Bethnal Green in East London, subsequently the Cordwainers Technical College. In the 1890s, the leather sellers began to support Herald's Institute, a technical school funded with a bequest from Benjamin Herald in 1727, which had been incorporated into the Borough Polytechnic Institute. The leather sellers sponsored lectures in leather manufacture there. They bought books, they provided prizes, they equipped a new laboratory, they funded a research scholarship, they even established a leather tanning school there. However, the Institute's buildings in Drummond Road, Bermondsey, were neither big nor grand enough for the company's ambitions, and so the leather sellers built these new premises for the Institute, then designated the Leather Sellers Technical College at 176 Tower Bridge Road, on the site of a former tannery occupied by Bacon's. The building, designed by Ilkington, that is the same man behind the London Leather, Hide and Wool Exchange, cost some £20,000. On its ground floor were two experimental tanneries, one for light and the other for heavy leather. There was also a machine house and a dye shop on this floor, while above there were 3 laboratories and a lecture theatre. The site also boasted a lime yard, drying room, courier shop and offices. It opened in October 1909, and within a month there were 23 students enrolled in day classes and 58 coming to those held in the evenings. Between the war, new courses were added, for example in chrome tanning, extensions were built, and a museum was even opened to hold the samples of leather collected from across the world. The leather sellers continued to support the college financially, often alongside grants from the London County Council and the Board of Education, as did local leather businesses, other London livery companies like the Couriers, and bequests from generous individuals which founded prizes and scholarships. After the Second World War, the government encouraged each industry to have a national technical college, that is a monotechnic. In 1951, the college achieved this status, and so it became the National Leather Sellers College. At that time, it offered a college diploma in leather manufacture, taken either with 2 years of full-time study or 3 years as a sandwich course. There were also short one-term courses specialising in heavy or light leather, dyeing and finishing, or the theory of leather manufacture. To meet the demand for its courses, the college acquired a new wing, research labs and modern equipment under its energetic chairman of governors, George Odey. Odey was not the only local worthy to have played an important role in the history of Leather Sellers College. In the 1890s, Samuel Bourne Bevington, then head of the Bevington family business at Neckinger Mills, became master of the Leather Sellers Company and chairman of the Heralds Institute School of Tanning. He was very much involved in efforts to establish the college and improve training provision in the leather trade. It was on his watch, for example, that the first meetings of the International Association of Leather Trades Chemists were held at the Heralds Institute and at Leather Sellers Hall on consecutive days in 1897. As we walk up Tower Bridge Road and turn left into Tooley Street, we find a statue raised in his honour by his fellow citizens. Bevington had a very impressive career indeed. He was a Justice of the Peace and the commanding officer of the 3rd Volunteer Battalion of the Queen's Royal West Surrey Regiment. In fact, in 1876, he even built a drill hall for the battalion at his own expense, and he donated the family house in Abbey Street for an officer's mess. In 1900, he was elected as a Liberal Unionist as the first mayor of the Metropolitan Borough of Bermondsey. He held this office until his death in 1907. That is 2 years before the opening of the college, which he had done so much to develop and establish. From here we can head back along Tooley Street to London Bridge. As we do, we might think about why the industry which once defined this little corner of South London is no longer here. In truth, the decline had begun, in Bermondsey at least, by the close of the 19th century, as tanneries in the north, especially around Merseyside and in Yorkshire, increasingly came to dominate the manufacture of heavy and shoe leathers. In these places, labour and rents were cheaper. There was easier access to soft water, and it was much less difficult to dispose of effluent than in London. In Bermondsey, the tanneries had to compete for space with an expanded civic infrastructure of roads, railways, houses and other public buildings. In the 1930s, for example, Bermondsey Borough Council compulsorily purchased the area to the south of the railway line at Bevington's Neckinger Mills site to build flats as part of their slum clearance programme. As a consequence, Bevington's moved some of its operations to a new site at Hawley Mill in Dartford, Kent. By then, all Britain's tanneries had to contend not just with a post-war slump, but with increased competition from cheaper manufacturers in Germany and America. In areas such as Bermondsey, where costs were higher, the pressure was particularly intense. It remained the preeminent centre for the manufacture of fancy leathers for luggage and small leather goods, and for the hired skin and leather merchants and brokers, but production of other types of leather was moving elsewhere. The workforce at Bevington's probably halved. The Bermondsey tanneries were kept very busy during the Second World War, but the area suffered terribly from bombing raids. In 1941, Garner's was effectively destroyed by incendiaries. Involved in the vital production of material for the war effort, There was no time for tanneries to stop production. So, in instances like this, of which there were many, they set up outside London, garners in Guildford and Cambridge, for example. Dennis Hutton was the director of garners interviewed for a research project in 1978. He recalled that the Blitz made a vast difference to the Bermondsey leather industries. This, along with stricter pollution regulations, caused them to move out or close down altogether. The bombing affected the supply of labour too. Families moved and children were evacuated. Well, things did not improve after the war. Certainly the supply of labour never recovered, as families were rehoused outside London in new towns or on suburban housing estates. In 1931, 111,000 people lived in the metropolitan borough of Bermondsey, but by 1961, the population had more than halved to just 52,000. In the 1950s, leather production went into decline across the country. New materials began to replace leather. Now rubber is much more popular for the soles of shoes, plastic more commonly used in industry, and leather seats in cars or a leather wallet have become premium purchases. That said, Bermondsey was still home to dozens, if not scores of businesses involved in the leather industry well into the 1950s and 1960s. In 1947, George Donath arrived in London from Hungary, and he recalls there being some 200 leather-related businesses in the Bermondsey area. 10 years later, there were still 55 active firms, including many of the names we have already noted, listed on a business register of the area. But by the 1970s, Britain was deindustrialising fast, and the loss of industry was felt most keenly in London, where higher property prices often made production unviable. Barrow, Hepburn and Gale ceased tanning locally in 1959 and manufacturing in 1985, while Bevington's called it a day in tanning and dressing in Bermondsey at least at the end of the 1970s. As the tanners and manufacturers went, so did the associated institutions. The British Leather Manufacturers Research Association, for instance, went to Egham shortly after the Second World War, while the British Leather Federation went to Northampton, where it now operates under the name Leather UK in a new leather trades house. The Leather Sellers College also moved to Northampton, following its merger with a leather department at what was then the Northampton College of Technology in 1975. It now forms part of the Institute for Creative Leather Technologies at Northampton University, while its museum collection went to the Museum of Leathercraft, also in Northampton. One could still buy leather products in a London leather hide and wool exchange in the 1980s, but in the 1990s the building was acquired and repurposed by a developer for London's service economy. All that remains now are the shades of what was once a mighty industry in Bermondsey.